Hi, I'm James Ward, a developer advocate at Google Cloud. This session is on Kubernetes CI/CD pipelines with Tekton. So let's dive in. Tekton is an open source Kubernetes-based CI/CD technology. And what we're going to do is walk through all the pieces of it so you can know how to build your own CI/CD pipelines that run on Kubernetes. So what Tekton is it's a bunch of CRDs, that's the custom resource definitions in Kubernetes, and they provide the primitives for building a pipeline that can do things like build, test, create and deploy container images, and that kind of thing. And it's pretty easy to install it in Kubernetes. There's just a YAML file, which you're going to be seeing a lot of YAML today. So let's talk about an example pipeline. Let's say that we make an SCM commit into Git or whatever you're using for source control, and then we want to run that change through a pipeline. We want to do a build on that source code, including the change. We want to run our tests. We want to produce an artifact that then we can run on our production system, whether that's a container image or something else. And then maybe we want to deploy to staging and maybe send out an email notification or something like that. So that's a pipeline, and this is the kind of pipeline that we can model in Tekton. There are some primitives that we'll be going through that Tekton uses to build these type of pipelines. So first, we have tasks. So a task are one piece of a pipeline. And a task has an input and an output, optionally on both of those. And so you can chain together tasks to create a pipeline. Let's take an example of this. So I have a repo on GitHub under my James Ward on GitHub, and it's hello jconf.dev. And this repo has in it a Maven-based Java project. And so this is the project that we're going to be using today as we walk through pipelines. So let's actually try out our pipeline, and we'll use that as a way to start learning about some of the pieces of the pipeline. So my application is already up and running, and I can actually go see that. I've successfully run the pipeline. I'm going to now do kubectl, and then I'm going to get my my Knative services. I'm using Knative to provide an abstraction on top of Kubernetes for running my applications. So let's go check out this application up and running on my Kubernetes instance. This first request takes a second because it actually, Knative scaled it down to no pods running the application, and so then it had to scale back up when I made that request, and there we go, we see our very simple hello world. So this is the application that we're going to be working with in our example. Let's go into the source code for this one, and we'll see our application.java. In here I'm using Micronaut to provide a nice REST interface to this thing, but of course you can use anything you want. Okay, so let's go in and edit my application, and I'm just going to edit right here in GitHub. Obviously, you would probably use an IDE and use a Git command line, that kind of thing. I'm going to make a change here. I'm going to say change it from hello world to hello jconf.dev. And then let's go down here and commit those changes directly to master. Usually do a pull request, have some way to test this, but we want to just see how this pipeline is going to actually work. So when I created that commit here, what it did was that kicked off my pipeline. And the way that it kicked off my pipeline was that it made a call to my Kubernetes cluster, and then walked through a bunch of different pieces inside of Tekton to kick off that CI/CD process. Okay, so let's actually go over to our Kubernetes and see what's actually happening. So, and then we'll start to unravel some of the pieces of this. So I'm going to use kubectl, and I'm going to say let's describe our pipeline runs. So our pipeline runs are the way that we run a pipeline. And what we'll see is that I've got a pipeline here that was just started recently and is now running through the steps of my pipeline. And you'll see that it's currently in the test step where it's running Maven test on this project. And we could watch this or continue to pull it, but what we'll see is that actually our pipeline failed, and you'll see that one of our tasks failed, and so it didn't continue. And we can come in here and see the log, so we can get a command here for that. And you'll see that in the logs, we're seeing that I have a test that expected hello world, but it was hello jconf.dev. So that stopped my pipeline, and we didn't deploy that latest version out. Okay, if we go back to our browser and we go back and edit, in this time, instead of editing our main application, let's go change our test so that our test passes. And so I'm just going to edit the test in here, and let's change this to jconf.dev. And then I'm going to, again, just commit this to master. And so now this will kick off yet another pipeline run that will run through all the steps to do the build, do the test, create the container image, and then do the deployment of this application to my Kubernetes cluster. So let's go look here at kubectl, and I'm going to get this time my pipeline runs. And you'll see that I've got a new pipeline run that is now in a status of running. So let's try this. Let's go and describe that pipeline run. So we can say describe, and then our pipeline run, and then let's paste that one in there. Okay, and you'll see that now it's running. It is now running the tests again, and this time the test should pass, and then it should continue on to the next step. And we're going to unravel all the different pieces of what's actually behind here, but I want you to see the actual pipeline working and doing what it's supposed to do, and then we'll go through a bunch of YAML files to see how this is actually assembled with Tekton. Okay, so let's see. It looks like it's still running those tests. It's got to download the Maven dependencies and then run the tests and that sort of thing. So it's going to take a minute, but while we're waiting for that to finish, let's go check out a few other things here. So we've got our pipeline run, which is currently running. If we look up in here, we can see the different statuses of all the different parts of this pipeline and see all the information about the pipeline. So it's a great way to explore the pipeline. You can also see just a snapshot like we did before with Git pipelines, see how long something is running for, see how long it takes, that kind of thing. Okay, so let's go describe this one again, see where we're at. Okay, so it looks like it completed the testing phase, and so now it's continuing on to the next part, which will be to create the container image. So as it's actually running through these different parts, these are running in Kubernetes pods. So what I can do is I can say kubectl get pods. And you'll see that there are pods for the different pipeline runs and then for the different steps of the pipeline runs as well. So the pipeline run that's running right now is this JHBCK one. You'll see that it did the test one, which completed, and now it's doing the source to image one. And we can actually watch the logs for these different steps as they're going. So right now we're on this source to image step where it's creating the container image using jib. And so let's paste in this command to see the logs. And it looks like it's already done, so we just showed us the end of that, but you'll see it built a container image, stored it on the Google Container Registry under those coordinates. Okay, so that part of the process is now done. Let's go back and see where we're at with our pipeline. Okay, so it looks like it has now completed 4, and that is all of them. So the whole pipeline now, which we can see with Git pods or the Git our pipeline runs. That'd be an easy way to see that, is that our pipeline succeeded, and so that's great. We can also check the logs for our deployment task, which should have done our deployment to Knative, and we see that sure enough, our service was replaced, and there we go. So now if we go back to our browser and to our service and refresh this, then sure enough, our new version of this service is now up and running. So great, so our pipeline worked, and the way that that it actually connected GitHub to the service is that on my repo I have a webhook set up, and let's we've got to zoom this out just a little bit, and we should be able to. Oh, for some reason the user I'm signed in, we can't see the settings, but trust me, there's a webhook that's set up on this repo that makes it so whenever there's a push event, it calls my Kubernetes service running in my Kubernetes instance, and we'll talk about in a minute how that all came together. Okay, so you've seen the pipeline working. Let's talk about the different parts of the pipeline. So the first part is tasks. So one of the primitives that it gets used in Tekton, or gets defined by Tekton, is a task. So a task is a custom resource definition that says what to do with inputs, how to transform them into outputs. And so this is really the primitive for how to do anything in Tekton. Tasks can take parameters. They can have multiple one or more steps that run in a defined order. And each step is a container image. So Tekton is built on Kubernetes, so it uses container images as the way to actually run stuff. And so we give each step a name, a container image, the commands and args, that sort of thing. So you probably don't want to have to build all your tasks yourself. Instead, it's nice if you can just use existing tasks to do things like a git clone, to do a container image build with jib. And so luckily there's a Tekton Catalog that has a bunch of installable CRDs for reusable tasks. So you're really just installing the CRDs for our tasks. And we can actually go in and see our tasks that are available that I've installed into my Kubernetes cluster with git tasks. And you'll see that I've got a git clone task, a jib maven task, a knative task for doing my deployment, and then I've got a test task which does my test. So those I added into my Kubernetes cluster before I started this demo. Okay, and I'll show you those in a little bit. Okay, so there's a huge catalog of tasks that are available. Let's go take a look at a task that I defined in my cluster, a custom task, to do my Maven test. So we're going to look in, all the source code for this is in this hello jconf.dev repo, and we're going to look at the pipeline YAML file. So you'll see that I've defined a new CRD. I'm using the task CRD from Tekton. I'm giving it a name test. We saw that one before. I'm telling it the workspaces to use for this task. So I'm going to use a workspace called source. And then I'm going to tell it the steps that I want to perform as part of this task. So I'm going to have a step that has a name of test. The container image that I'm going to use is the adopt OpenJDK, OpenJDK 8. I'm going to tell it the working directory that I want it to run this command in. And I'm going to tell it to run Maven. And then I'm going to tell it to run the test target in Maven. So if this returns with an error exit code, then this task will fail. And you can manually run tasks with something called task run, but I don't usually use task run because I'm working with pipelines, and so I instead run pipelines instead of tasks. And we'll get to that in just a second. Okay, so that's how you define a task, and we'll see in a little bit how we can reuse existing tasks from that Tekton catalog. Okay, so the next primitive that we're going to talk about in Tekton is a pipeline. So a pipeline is a way to chain together a bunch of tasks. So we can say my testing is one task. Before that, my git clone is a task. So we want to chain those together. First, we want to do the git clone, and then we want to do the testing, and then continue on. So we can chain tasks together and set up a dependency graph of tasks. In Kubernetes, each task is run on a pod, and we saw that when we looked at the pods in our cluster. We can do fan out and fan in on tasks, so that means we can do multiple things in parallel, or we can wait for multiple things to finish before we fan back in. And then a pipeline can have resources and parameters like tasks can, and so these are the things that the way to provide variables to a task or to a pipeline. Okay, and then sometimes we want to have a way to manually run a pipeline, and so this is a pipeline run. So what we can do is we are going to tell it the parameters to provide to a pipeline, and then we're going to actually run the pipeline with a pipeline run. And we can take advantage of some Kubernetes features like service accounts and pod templates and that sort of thing. When we do our pipeline runs, we can configure timeouts as well. And you can also cancel pipeline runs. Okay, so let's actually take a look at our pipeline, the next piece of YAML here. So in our pipeline YAML file, you'll see that I'm setting up a pipeline. And my pipeline, I give a name, build deploy pipeline. And we can go over to kubectl. And I think we only looked at pipeline runs. So let's look at our pipelines. So we can see that, here we go, there's my build and deploy pipeline that's up in my Kubernetes cluster. And this pipeline, it has a spec which includes the workspace that it needs, any resources that it needs, and then any parameters that it needs. So for my pipeline, I need a resource for my container image. I also need a parameter for my service name, which is my Knative service name. I need a get URL, I need a get branch, and I need my image URL, which is my container image URL. Okay, so those are the things that when I run this pipeline, I'm going to have to provide. Now, a pipeline, as I said, is composed of a bunch of tasks. So the first task is get clone, and you'll see that it's referencing a task with a name get-clone. And if we look back in here, you'll see that sure enough, I have a task that I've installed through the Tekton Catalog, which is my get clone task. And then that task has some parameters, so the URL that we want to clone, and you'll see where I bind that in to the parameters from the pipeline, and then same with the revision. And there's other parameters that you can specify optionally as well. And then I tell it the workspace, which is the optional shared drive, hard drive space that can get used across tasks. And so I am specifying my workspace that came as an input into the pipeline, and I'm binding that to a workspace that this particular task needs, named output. Okay, so that's my get clone task, and that one ran. We didn't even look at that one because that one was boring. And then I have my task named test. It references a task named test, which we saw defined up here. Okay, and that task test, I'm setting up a dependency on get clone. So after get clone is finished successfully, then we can run the test task. And then again, we bind the workspaces that are needed for that, which looking back at our task, we'll see that it needs a workspace named source. So that's why we're binding in the source. And so the contents of the workspace get shared across the different tasks. And so that's how we can do a get clone, and then we can take that source code that was cloned and then use that in our test task. Okay, so then the next task in my pipeline is source to image. And with source to image, I am referencing a task Jib Maven, and Jib is a Java build tool plugin that creates container images. And so I'm saying run this after test. So I don't want to create my container image unless I have successfully completed my tests. And then I give it the resources, which takes a resource of an image output. So this is what this task produces, is an image. That's a container image. And then again, I need my access to my shared workspace. Okay, so that's the Jib Maven, and that's what we saw actually store the container up into the Google Container Registry, which we can go and check out in the Google Container Registry UI, and we should see, this is called jconf, let's search for that, there it is, our hello jconf.dev, and you'll see that this container image was uploaded 10 minutes ago. Okay, so that was our jib to Maven task. Okay, then the final task is the deploy task, where we're referencing the knative task. We're telling it to run after our source to image task. We need the image to be created so that then we can use that image, deploy it. And now I'm telling kn to create a service, or it'll update it to if it exists. And I'm giving it the service name, which came in as a parameter to the pipeline. I don't remember why I'm using force. And then I give it the image URL to the container image URL, which is this one that was created from that previous task. Okay, so that's my whole pipeline here that you saw already working and going from a commit on GitHub to running through the pipeline. So there's a whole other piece of this that actually linked together the webhook call from GitHub to actually running the pipeline, and that's what we're going to dive into next. So let's talk about that piece. Okay, so that's called triggers, and there's a separate project in Tekton called Tekton Triggers. The previous stuff that you saw is all part of a project in Tekton called Tekton Pipelines, and so now we're into Tekton Triggers. And what triggers allow us to do is have event-driven pipeline runs. So we could, actually, before I'd show you that, let me show you one other piece here, which will help put this together a little more, which is a pipeline run. So this is a manual pipeline run. If I want to run that pipeline manually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kubectl apply this YAML document, which is going to create the pipeline run. And I didn't do that for this example because everything is driven from a commit on GitHub. But you'll see I'm referencing my pipeline with that name, and then I need to provide all the inputs or parameters that this pipeline needs. So you'll remember that it needed a resource, which is an image, and this is how we assemble an image from a URL there. And then we give it the parameters. This is all, I'm just hard-coded in here, but when we get into the triggers, you'll see how the contents of the trigger push, the webhook call, actually provide all of these parameters. Okay, so we fill in the get URL to clone, the branch, the image URL, and then we needed a workspace, so we create a volume claim in Kubernetes, and that's where our shared disk comes from that gets used across those tasks. Okay, so you can run these pipelines manually as well, and I did that when I was testing things out, but normally you shouldn't have to do a manual pipeline run. Okay, so now on to triggers. So triggers allow us to create these pipeline runs in an event-driven way instead of manually. So as an example, and the one that we used in the demo, is a GitHub webhook, and that GitHub webhook is running inside of my Kubernetes cluster, and so when it receives a call from GitHub with the payload of, hey, I got a commit event, then it's going to be able to drop an event into Tekton, which kicks off or creates the pipeline run for me. And so there's a couple different pieces of how we link together triggers. There's a trigger binding, and the trigger binding, it maps events that have come in from the webhook request to parameters in a trigger template. So we get these parameters out of the HTTP body of the request, and then we pass those to the trigger template, and then the trigger template maps those parameters to a pipeline run. But then we actually need something listening in our Kubernetes cluster to be able to handle that webhook request. And so this is an event listener. And so the event listener out of the box supports GitHub, and you can use GitLab and other ones as well. But this creates a HTTP endpoint that will do that will be able to take the trigger binding, take the trigger template, and from an HTTP request create the pipeline run. Okay, so let's go take a look at the parts of the trigger here that put this all together. So I've got this trigger.yaml file, and up at the beginning of the file is a bunch of stuff we have to do for security. So there's a role that we create that we give access to the things that it needs, and we create a service account, and then we create a role binding where we bind the service account to the role, and then I've got a secret because we want to secure the with a shared secret. We want to secure the communication for calling this endpoint that we're going to have running in our Kubernetes cluster, and you'll see my very secret password for my particular endpoint there. Okay, and then we get into the trigger binding that we talked about earlier. So the trigger binding, it has a name. It's a pipeline binding. And this is just saying how to map the HTTP request body to particular parameters. So in the body, it's JSON, and so I'm going to traverse down the JSON, get the head commit ID, and that's going to be my Git revision, and then the body repository Git URL is going to be my Git repo URL, and then the body repository name is going to be my repo name. And so that's just kind of moving the HTTP request into some params that I can use inside of Tekton. And of course, like with everything else, we could go explore these pipeline or trigger bindings. So I can say, let's get my trigger bindings, and you'll see that I've got my pipeline binding there. And of course, we could describe it and look at it, but it'll look just like this. Okay, so then the next piece is my trigger template, and so it's a pipeline, or I give it a name of pipeline template, and then my trigger template has parameters. There's a Git revision, a Git repo URL, repo name, so just like the ones that you saw before. But now my trigger template, it now knows how to take these parameters and map them to a pipeline run. So what we're telling this trigger template is, here's what you're going to actually create when that trigger runs. And so we're going to tell it how to create a name for the pipeline run. And we actually saw that when we looked at our pipeline runs. You'll see that it has this UID there that got inserted in from that. Okay, and then we need to tell it what pipeline to reference. We're going to reference the build deploy pipeline. We want to give it a service account that this is going to run as. KN deployer account is something that came with the Knative came with the Tekton Catalog for Knative deployer, and so this is a specific service account that's going to allow us to deploy to Knative, and so we're going to use that service account. Then we need to specify the resources and params and workspaces for our pipeline, just like we saw in pipeline run. So we're going to create an image, but this time we're going to bind it to a parameter that we get from our trigger template through our trigger binding. Okay, so then we have our parameters, service name, that's what gets used for the Knative service, Git URL, Git branch, and image URL. And then we have our workspaces, and we specify how to create those. Okay, so that's our trigger template. And then we need a way to expose an HTTP endpoint that's going to actually use that trigger template to create the pipeline run. So I create an event listener. This is another CRD from Tekton. And this is my GitHub listener. And what I'm doing is I'm giving it a service account. This is the one that got created up at the top of this file, the Tekton triggers admin. And then I'm going to tell it a little bit of information about this trigger. I'm going to use an interceptor, which is a GitHub interceptor. So this is something that comes with Tekton that knows how to understand the HTTP request from GitHub, knows how to handle the secret and validate the secret. And then I'm going to tell it the event types that I want to handle, which is just a push event. And then I give it the bindings, so that's the pipeline bindings that we defined, and then the template. So all of that stuff is going to get combined together when an HTTP request comes in to create that pipeline run and populate the parameters correctly. Okay, now the last thing to do is to expose my service that is created from this event listener as a public endpoint. And so what I do is I create a service in Kubernetes. I give it a name there. It's a load balancer, so that will give us the external IP address for that thing, and then tell it how to find the event listener, the actual service underneath the covers. Okay, and we can actually go into the GKE, that's what I'm using for Kubernetes here, and go see some of these things inside of our services, for example. So if I go to my services, and then you'll see that I'm on my jconf.dev cluster, and then you'll see that there's this EL GitHub listener load balancer, and it has this endpoint here, this public endpoint, and that's what I actually put into the webhook that gets called from GitHub. If we could go in and see the settings for this repo, we would see that endpoint in there. Okay, so that's all the different pieces for how we link all that together, so that from an HTTP webhook call, we run that whole pipeline, and of course we can see all the different pieces of this with kubectl. So we looked at the trigger bindings, we looked at the pipeline runs, we saw how all those different pieces. I think the one piece that we haven't seen in here yet is our service. So these are our Kubernetes services. So you can see this EL GitHub listener service, and then my load balancer service with the public external IP address. And then we can also, I think we already saw our Kubernetes or our Knative services, but you can see those there as well. See the endpoint that we made the request to. We can also in Knative check out like our revisions and see that I've made 3 revisions to that particular service, with the most recent one, the one that succeeded getting through a pipeline that we saw a few minutes ago. Okay, so that is your quick overview into Tekton and how we can build pipelines. And if you want to check out the source code for this application and all that wonderful YAML, then that's all up on my GitHub under github.com, James Ward, and then hello-jconf.dev. And let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.